Hey guys, tonight we begin with a time when early human ancestors weren't debating philosophy. They were debating whether that rustling in the grass was food danger or both. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the world 4.7 million years ago, waking up alive wasn't just a pleasant surprise. It was a statistical anomaly worth celebrating. You didn't open your eyes thinking about breakfast or morning stretches. You opened your eyes thinking, I am still here, and no one has chewed on me yet. There were no houses, no doors to lock, no guard dogs to bark when trouble was near. If you were lucky, you had spent the night in a tree, wedged between two branches in the vague hope that predators preferred their meals without splinters. Less fortunate mornings meant waking up on the open ground with only a few leaves or a mound of dirt for bedding. Privacy, of course, didn't exist. Everyone in your little group, and sometimes a few hangers-on from neighboring bands, slept close for warmth and safety. This meant that rolling over could put you face to face with your cousin, a beetle the size of your thumb, or the smelly evidence that last night's berries hadn't agreed with someone. The first thing you did was listen. The forest and grasslands were never silent, and each sound carried weight. Birds meant daylight and possibly breakfast. Insects meant you had survived the cold night. Heavy footsteps in the underbrush meant you should already be halfway up the nearest tree. Getting up was an act of courage. You never knew what the night had delivered while you slept. A nearby lion, a python resting in a sunny spot, or a fresh pile of droppings that suggested something very large had been here recently. Once you'd established that you weren't about to be eaten, you scanned for your group. Staying together was your insurance policy. Lone wanderers had the lifespan of an undercooked fish. There was no mirror to check your appearance, but if there had been, it would not have helped. Your hair was matted with leaves. Your skin was streaked with dirt, and your only makeup was whatever pollen or berry juice you'd smeared on yourself yesterday. Still, you were breathing. The sun was up, and with that you'd accomplished the day's first and most important task existing. The rest of the day would be harder finding water, food, and shelter before darkness returned. But for this one brief, precious moment, you could bask in the quiet, simple joy of not being dead. If waking up alive was the first victory of the day, finding breakfast was the second. And this one required a little more than just luck. In the prehistoric world, breakfast didn't come with menus, cooking instructions, or expiration dates. It came in three vague categories: plants, animals, and things you really hoped were edible. The morning meal was often dictated by what you stumbled across first. Maybe it was a tree heavy with figs. Maybe it was a bush covered in berries that looked safe, although no one in your group could quite remember if the last guy who ate them had survived. Early humans didn't have field guides to help identify plants. Their method was trial and error. If the taste made your lips tingle, you stopped eating. If it made your vision blurry, you really stopped eating. Protein was harder to come by. If you were ambitious, you might climb a tree in search of bird eggs, delicious, fragile, and heavily defended by angry parents with sharp beaks. If you were lucky, you might find a lizard basking in the sun, quick to catch if you were faster, and eaten raw since fire was still a mystery. Chewing carefully to avoid teeth or bones was part of the ritual. Sometimes breakfast came pre-packaged in the form of a half-eaten carcass left behind by a predator. This was a mixed blessing. On one hand, free meat. On the other, the predator might still be nearby, wondering why you were holding its leftovers. In these situations, eating fast wasn't just smart, it was essential. Water often counted as breakfast too. A few gulps from a muddy stream could help fill an empty stomach, though the side effects included stomach cramps and the occasional hallucination. But when your other option was starvation, you drank anyway, telling yourself it added flavor. All of this was eaten without plates, utensils, or napkins. Meals were taken standing up, crouched down, or on the move, because lingering too long in one spot meant turning yourself into someone else's breakfast. By the time you'd swallowed the last bite, your stomach was only half satisfied, but your survival odds had increased. And in the prehistoric world, that was the only score that mattered. Finding water was easy. finding safe water that was a mythical concept. Rivers, streams, ponds, all of them looked inviting, shimmering under the sunlight, promising life and delivering a buffet of parasites, bacteria, and the occasional microscopic hitchhiker that would set up permanent residence in your intestines. Still, thirst killed faster than hunger, and in the wild you didn't get to be choosy. A puddle left over from last night's rain could be a lifesaver. So could a shallow stream, even if it doubled as a crocodile's favorite lunch spot. The risk calculation was simple. Drink now, and maybe get sick later. Or don't drink, and definitely get sick sooner. Of course, there was a method to this madness. You didn't just march up to the water's edge and start sipping. That was the sort of behavior that got you turned into an educational example for the rest of the group. First, you scanned for movement ripples that weren't from the wind shadows that lingered just a little too long under the surface. If the coast seemed clear, you approached, slowly crouched down and drank with the speed of someone who knew they might have to run at any second. Some groups developed clever tricks. Scooping water with cupped hands kept you further from the edge. Finding a narrow bend in the river gave you a better view of incoming trouble. And in rare cases, you might even find a naturally formed pool away from the main current, a prehistoric luxury spa, if you ignored the dead insects floating on top. There was no concept of boiling or filtering. If the water was clear, it was considered probably fine. If it was murky, you drank it anyway and pretended the earthy flavor was intentional. Occasionally, this led to days of stomach cramps and other unpleasant consequences. But survival wasn't about comfort. It was about stacking the odds in your favor, one cautious sip at a time. And so every drink was a gamble. Sometimes you walked away refreshed. Sometimes you walked away queasy. And sometimes you didn't walk away at all. But no matter the risks, water was life. And life rarely came without a few hidden teeth. In the prehistoric world, fashion wasn't about style. It was about whatever stuck to you overnight. The first outfit of the day was whatever dirt leaves and mystery substances you picked up while sleeping on the ground or wedged in a tree. Some mornings you woke up wearing a patchwork of crushed grass and dried mud that could almost pass as camouflage, assuming you were trying to blend in with a compost heap. There were no animal skin cloaks, no carefully woven fabrics, and definitely no summer or winter wardrobe. If you happened to have a bit of fur left over from a kill, you might drape it around yourself for warmth. But more often than not, your only real layer was your own skin, and perhaps the occasional insect that decided you were an all-you-can-eat buffet. Seasonal changes were handled with the most advanced technology available at the time. Moving. If it got cold, you followed the sun. If it got too hot, you found shade. If it rained, you got wet. No one complained about soggy clothes because there weren't any to complain about. The idea of clean clothing didn't exist either. Washing yourself meant walking into a river and hoping the current did most of the work. Even then, 10 minutes later, you'd be covered in dust pollen or the contents of whatever fruit had exploded in your hands. Occasionally, body decoration appeared not for modesty, but for intimidation or amusement. Smearing yourself with clay could help keep insects away, though it also made you look like a confused statue. Rubbing crushed berries into your skin left streaks of red or purple, which might have been considered attractive or possibly a sign that you'd been in a fight with a particularly juicy plant. Footwear, not a chance. Your feet developed calluses thick enough to rival stone tools. But stepping on a sharp rock could still make even the most hardened hunter hop around like they'd just stepped on a thorn. And yet, despite the lack of fabrics, zippers, or even a vague sense of modesty, no one froze to death, en masse, or melted in the sun. The prehistoric dress code was simple. Wear what the environment gives you and hope it doesn't bite back. In the prehistoric world, everyone was on the neighborhood watch whether they liked it or not. There were no locked doors, no fences, and no beware of dog signs. The only thing keeping predators at bay was your ability to notice them before they noticed you. The problem was, predators were everywhere. Some of them hunted at night, some in the day, and some just hung around waiting for you to make a mistake. Big cats liked to lurk in tall grass, blending in until the last possible second. Hyenas traveled in packs, laughing in a way that made you think they already knew how this story would end. And snakes, they didn't need to chase you. They just waited for you to step exactly where you shouldn't. There was no centralized alarm system unless you counted the collective scream of the group when something lunged out of the bushes. This was often followed by frantic pointing, rock throwing, and the occasional self-sacrificial distraction from the bravest or most unlucky member of the band. Survival meant constant awareness. Your eyes were always scanning the trees for shadows that didn't belong, your ears straining for the sound of twigs snapping in the wrong direction. Every rustle could be a breeze or something considering you as lunch. Group living was the only real defense. The more of you there were, the better your chances of spotting trouble early, and if it came to it, of outrunning at least one other person. Cooperation was key, but so was self-preservation. The prehistoric social contract was simple. We protect each other, but if a leopard grabs you, that's between you and the leopard. Some groups even developed informal lookout roles, though these weren't glamorous positions. Standing on a rock to watch for danger mostly meant you'd be the first one spotted by danger. Still, the role had one perk. If you saw trouble coming in time, you might get a head start on running. And so the prehistoric neighborhood watch was an operation staffed entirely by the unwilling, unpaid, and occasionally eaten. No one asked to be on the roster. You just were from the moment you opened your eyes until the moment you closed them. Hopefully not forever. Before language evolved into the complex web of sounds, grammar, and sarcasm we have today, communication among early humans was minimalist. You didn't have the luxury of explaining yourself in detail. Instead, you relied on a combination of pointing, grunting, and facial expressions that could range from "look out" to "I think that berry is killing me." The system worked most of the time. Pointing was the most versatile tool in the prehistoric vocabulary. You could point at food, at a predator, or at something vaguely interesting, though this often caused confusion. Point at a distant gazelle, and you might be suggesting a hunt. Point at a nearby bush, and someone might interpret it as "hide there," even if your actual meaning was "don't touch that. It's full of stinging insects." Grunts were equally multi-purpose. A low drawn-out could mean food was good, or it could mean you were choking on it. A sharper might mean watch out, or it might mean that's mine. The only way to know for sure was to observe the speaker's eyebrows and hope for the best. Hand gestures filled in the gaps, though accuracy varied wildly. A wave could mean come here or go away, depending on the urgency. Flailing your arms might mean danger, or I'm on fire, or possibly there's a bug on me. This ambiguity kept life interesting and occasionally shortened it. When things got truly urgent, the most reliable form of communication was screaming. A scream meant something bad was happening right now. It didn't matter if it was a predator, a rockfall, or stepping into a wasp nest. Everyone screamed, and everyone ran. The details could be sorted out later, assuming anyone was still around to share them. The lack of language also made social dynamics interesting. Negotiations over food were more like staring contests. Flirtation involved lingering glances, awkward noises, and maybe a shared piece of fruit if you were feeling bold. Arguments could escalate from grunts to shoving in seconds, often resolved by one party stomping away and sulking behind a tree. It wasn't eloquent, but it was effective enough. With nothing but noise hands and frantic pointing early, humans managed to share warnings, coordinate hunts, and occasionally insult each other. And really, what else do you need for a functioning society? Hunting in theory was simple. Find animal, kill animal, eat animal. In practice, it was more like find animal, scare animal, chase animal, get exhausted, and hope the animal trips over something before you do. There were no bows, no spears with metal tips, and definitely no clever traps built from blueprints. The main tools were rocks, sticks, and the occasional sharp piece of bone, all of which were just as likely to injure you as your target. Throwing a rock could be effective if you happened to be close enough to touch the animal with your other hand. Otherwise, the rock was mostly a polite request for the prey to run faster. The first step of a hunt was spotting the target. Gazelles, antelopes, and small deer were ideal not because they were easy to catch, but because they had meat worth the effort. The problem: they also had legs that could carry them out of sight in the time it took you to blink. Chasing them was a team sport. The fastest members of the group would start the pursuit, driving the animal toward others waiting ahead. Waiting was a generous term here. Mostly it meant standing in the general area and hoping to be in the right place when the prey got tired. Unfortunately, animals seemed to have far more stamina than humans, and they weren't above zigzagging through terrain that made you question why you'd gotten out of bed at all. When hunting smaller prey like rabbits or lizards, the approach was sneakier. This involved crawling on your belly, moving so slowly that plants had time to grow around you. The reward was a quick burst of motion, hopefully yours, and the chance to grab the animal before it disappeared into a hole you couldn't fit into. Of course, not every hunt ended in triumph. Sometimes you came back with nothing but bruises, empty hands, and a story about how it got away this time. Other times you found yourself being hunted instead. A reminder that chasing a wild boar was a great way to meet a wild boar's tusks. Still, even a small success could feed the group for a day, making the exhaustion worth it. And if you failed, well, there were always berries, assuming you hadn't learned the hard way which ones were the poisonous kind. If hunting was high risk, high reward gathering was the prehistoric equivalent of clocking in for a safe but boring desk job. You weren't going to bring down a mammoth, but you also weren't going to be gored, mauled, or trampled. The worst that could happen was an itchy rash unless you picked the wrong mushrooms, in which case you'd be seeing colors for the rest of the day, assuming you saw anything at all. Gathering was a group activity, usually done by those who didn't fancy sprinting after angry wildlife. The method was straightforward. Wander around, spot something edible looking, and hope your instincts or someone else's previous survival confirmed it wouldn't kill you. Plants with bright colors were suspicious. Plants that smelled bad were suspicious. Plants that looked delicious were suspicious too, because nature had a sense of humor. Berries were the most common find. If they were sweet, you'd eat them immediately. If they were bitter, you might still eat them immediately, because prehistoric hunger didn't allow for picky eating. Tubers and roots were another staple, though digging them up required the patience of a saint and fingernails made of stone. Nuts were a special prize, a high-calorie jackpot, but cracking them open without tools often turned into an impromptu dental exam. Seeds and edible leaves filled in the gaps, though no one looked excited while chewing on a handful of raw foliage. Occasionally you got lucky and stumbled upon honey, which was pure gold in the prehistoric diet. The only catch was that bees were also prehistoric, and their opinions on sharing were firm and delivered with stingers. Gatherers weren't entirely safe from danger. Snakes loved hiding in bushes. Wild pigs sometimes took offense at humans stealing their snacks. And once in a while another group of humans would wander by your basket and decide they were hungrier than you were. Still, gathering had its perks. You could grunt chat while working, keep an eye on the kids, and avoid sprinting across plains in a desperate attempt to bring home dinner. Best of all, when the hunters returned, empty-handed, the gatherer's haul was suddenly the main course, and no one cared that it was just a pile of roots and berries. In the great prehistoric survival plan, gathering wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And in a world where reliability often meant life or death, that made you the quiet heroes of the tribe. Finding shelter in the prehistoric world wasn't about comfort. It was about staying alive long enough to complain about the lack of comfort. The definition of home was flexible. Sometimes it was a shallow cave. Sometimes it was the space under a leaning tree. And sometimes it was just a rock big enough to hide behind while you pretended it was a wall. Caves were the top-tier option. They provided shade protection from rain, and at least one solid wall you didn't have to build yourself. The downside: they were usually already occupied by something with more teeth than you. Negotiating ownership involved a complex strategy, yelling waving sticks and running away when the current resident didn't seem impressed. If caves were unavailable, overhangs and hollowed-out trees became prime real estate. They didn't offer the same level of protection, but they were better than lying in the open, where the only roof was the occasional bird flying overhead, sometimes leaving a surprise you didn't ask for. The truly desperate option was making your own shelter. This meant stacking branches, leaves, and mud into something vaguely tent-shaped. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't waterproof, but it gave the comforting illusion of security. If the wind blew too hard, you might wake up with your roof in another time zone, but at least you tried. Placement mattered too. Building your shelter too close to a river was an invitation for flooding or a nighttime visit from crocodiles. Setting up on a hill meant better drainage, but also more wind and fewer places to hide if trouble arrived. Inside furnishings consisted of whatever was soft enough to sit or lie on without spraining something. Piles of grass worked as long as you didn't mind the bugs moving in with you. Flat rocks could double as seats, tables, or weapons if necessary. And lighting came courtesy of the sun or the moon if you were unlucky enough to still be awake. In short, prehistoric shelter was never about luxury. It was about putting something between you and the weather and hoping that something didn't collapse, blow away, or bite you in the night. Fire was the prehistoric equivalent of a smartphone. Once you had it, you wondered how you had ever lived without it. And once you lost it, you panicked. The problem was, unlike smartphones, you couldn't just turn it back on. Fire had to be stolen from nature, coaxed into life, and guarded like it was your only child. Because in a way it was. Most groups first encountered fire after a lightning strike, when the sky decided to drop a flaming tree into the middle of the savannah. The brave or the reckless would rush in to snatch a burning branch before the flames died out. This was often followed by frantic running, yelling, and shaking the branch to avoid becoming part of the fire yourself. Once you had fire, keeping it alive became the tribe's #1 priority. You couldn't make more, at least not until someone accidentally figured out that rubbing sticks together really fast could work. Until then, the fire was like a grumpy pet that refused to feed itself. Someone had to watch it, constantly feeding it wood, protecting it from rain, and making sure no one tripped and fell into it. The benefits were worth the trouble. Fire cooked food, which made it tastier and less likely to kill you. It scared away predators, or at least made them think twice before charging. And on cold nights it kept you from shivering yourself into an early grave. But fire also had a dark side. Get too close and you'd learn the meaning of pain in a very direct, sizzling way. Forget to watch it, and the entire savannah could go up in flames, taking your shelter, your food, and possibly your eyebrows with it. Socially, fire became the center of everything. People gathered around it to eat, talk, and occasionally stare at it like it was performing magic, because to them it was. The flames danced, the wood cracked, and for a moment life felt almost civilized. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just survival, it was prestige. Whoever controlled the flames controlled comfort, safety, and dinner, which meant if the fire went out on your watch, you might want to start running before everyone else realized. In the prehistoric world, predators weren't something you saw on a nature documentary. They were something you saw when you woke up in the middle of the night and realized something was breathing just a little too close. There were no fences, no firearms, and no animal control officers to call. If you wanted to survive, you had to know who might eat you and how to make sure they didn't. The lineup was impressive. Big cats were the worst. Sleek, silent, and faster than you on your best day. They could sneak up so quietly that your only warning might be the sound of someone else screaming. Hyenas were next on the list, coming in packs with jaws strong enough to bite through bones and the unsettling habit of laughing about it. Crocodiles waited patiently in rivers, pretending to be logs until you got close enough for a surprise death roll. Then there were snakes, some venomous, some constricting, and all of them experts at being exactly where you didn't want them to be. Even birds got in on the action. Giant raptors could swoop down and carry off smaller humans, which made for a bad day for the victim and a very awkward evening for the rest of the group. Avoiding predators was an all-day, everyday job. You learned to scan the horizon, listen for unusual silences, and assume that if you couldn't see danger, it was probably right behind you. Sleeping in groups helped, though. It also meant you were statistically more likely to be woken up by someone else's panic than by the actual predator. Sometimes the best defense was offense. Yelling, throwing rocks, or waving sticks to convince the predator you weren't worth the effort. This worked better in large groups. Alone, it was basically just a dramatic way to say goodbye. Despite the constant danger, humans adapted. We learned patterns. Which rivers hid crocodiles, which bushes hid snakes, which trees were good for climbing in emergencies. Survival was less about fighting and more about not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if all else failed, you just had to be faster than the slowest person in your group. Harsh, yes, but in the prehistoric world, morality often took a back seat to making it through the night. Parenting in the prehistoric world was not about piano lessons, bedtime stories, or packing school lunches. It was about keeping your offspring alive long enough for them to learn how not to die on their own. That was the entire curriculum, Survival 101. From birth, prehistoric babies came into the world with one major flaw. They were loud enough to attract predators from impressive distances. You couldn't shush them with a pacifier because those didn't exist, and you couldn't put them in a crib because cribs hadn't been invented yet. Your only option was to carry them everywhere and hope your glare could convince them to stop broadcasting your location. Carrying a child wasn't as simple as it sounds. You had no stroller, no baby sling, and no ergonomic carrier. You had arms, and if you were lucky, a strip of animal hide to tie them to your back. This meant that every task, from gathering food to climbing a tree to avoid a leopard, had to be done with a small human clinging to you like a particularly needy backpack. Teaching began early. Toddlers were shown what berries to eat, how to throw rocks, and where not to wander. Lessons were usually hands-on and occasionally involved watching another child make a terrible mistake and learning from it. The "don't touch that snake" lesson usually only needed to be taught once. Discipline was straightforward. If you misbehaved, you got a sharp look, a firm word, or a tap, but mostly the consequences were natural. Refuse to follow the group and you'd find yourself alone. Ignore the warnings about the river and the crocodiles would provide feedback. The harsh environment was the ultimate parenting partner. Childhood didn't last long. By the time a kid could walk steadily, they were expected to contribute. Carrying sticks for the fire, helping with gathering scaring birds away from drying meat. These were the prehistoric chores. Complaining wasn't really an option because no dinner wasn't a threat. It was the logical outcome of not helping. Despite the constant danger, prehistoric parenting had its rewards. Watching your child manage their first solo berry-picking trip, or seeing them successfully avoid being eaten, gave you a rare sense of pride. And if they made it to adulthood, you'd know you'd done your job. At least until they started producing loud, fragile little humans of their own. In the prehistoric world, disagreements happened. Maybe someone took your favorite sitting rock. Maybe they ate more than their share of the roasted lizard. Or maybe they gave you a funny look while you were gnawing on a mammoth bone. Whatever the cause, conflicts were inevitable and the solutions were uncomplicated. Option 1: fists. When tempers flared, there was no formal debate, no arbitration, and definitely no "let's talk about our feelings." Instead, you'd get a short burst of shouting, more like aggressive grunting, followed by a very physical exchange of opinions. These fights were quick, brutal, and almost never decided anything beyond who was going to need a new front tooth. Option 2: rocks. Rocks were the prehistoric multi-tool useful for hunting, building, cracking nuts, and in moments of anger convincing someone to see your point of view, preferably from a safe distance. Throwing a rock was a clear escalation, though. Once the first rock flew, the discussion was officially over, and everyone in the area knew it. The rest of the group would step back, partly to avoid getting hit, and partly to enjoy the show. Option 3: running away. By far the most underrated conflict resolution method. Running spared you from injuries, grudges, and the possibility of becoming an accidental snack for a predator drawn by the noise. Of course, running away came with its own risks, namely looking like a coward. But in prehistoric terms, a living coward was still better than a dead hero. Sometimes disputes were resolved indirectly. The group's elders, those who had managed to survive long enough to be considered wise, would step in not because they were particularly fair, but because fights risked injury, and injured people slowed everyone down. Their mediation style was straightforward. They told both parties to shut up and go find food. In the absence of formal laws, the real consequence of starting too many fights was social isolation. If no one wanted to hunt or gather with you, your chances of survival dropped faster than a rock aimed at your head. So while prehistoric conflict resolution might not have been elegant, it was effective in its own way. The choices were simple, the outcomes clear, and if you lived to tell the story, you'd probably think twice before starting the next one. Migration wasn't a seasonal vacation. It was a desperate necessity. When the food ran out, the water dried up, or the predators got a little too comfortable hanging around camp, the solution was simple. Pack up everything you owned, which was basically a stick, a rock, and whatever you were wearing, and start walking. There was no "are we there yet?" because no one knew where there was. The decision to move was made collectively, though collectively usually meant the oldest, grumpiest member of the group saying, "We can't stay here, everything is dead," and everyone else agreeing. The actual journey was slow, really slow. Children had short legs, the elderly had sore knees, and someone was always stopping to pick berries, check animal tracks, or complain about blisters. Progress was measured in how far until the next shade tree, not in miles. Carrying belongings was another challenge. With no backpacks, your best bet was to bundle your possessions in animal hides or balance them awkwardly on your head. If you had a baby, congratulations. You were now a mobile crib. If you had extra food, you were everyone's best friend until it ran out. Food along the way was hit or miss. Some days you stumbled upon a lucky find, a bush full of berries, a dead animal that still looked edible. Other days you went to bed with an empty stomach, cursing every plant you passed for not being food. Water was even trickier. You either found a clean source or you drank from a muddy puddle and hoped for the best. Then there was the weather. Migration could mean walking under a scorching sun, shivering through cold winds, or getting drenched in sudden downpours. You learned quickly that perfect weather didn't exist, only less bad weather. Eventually, after days or weeks of walking, you'd find a new spot that seemed promising. There'd be water, food sources, and maybe a cave that didn't have anything currently living in it. You'd set up camp, sigh in relief, and start telling yourself this was the perfect place to settle down forever. Of course, forever, in prehistoric terms, usually meant until the food ran out again. For prehistoric humans, survival wasn't an occasional challenge. It was the full-time, unpaid, no-days-off job everyone had. You didn't prepare for emergencies because every single day was an emergency. There was no concept of comfort beyond not currently being eaten, and no luxury higher than having a full belly and all your limbs. Survival wasn't just about reacting to danger. It was baked into every choice you made. Which berries you picked, where you built your shelter, how far you wandered from the group. Each decision was a delicate balance between finding resources and becoming resources for something else. Social bonds were part of the strategy. Alone, you were an appetizer. In a group, you were part of a noisy, unpredictable herd that could scare off predators and share the workload. Sure, living with other people meant constant bickering over food, sleeping space, and who got the driest spot by the fire, but the trade-off was worth it. Even the most annoying member of the group might one day be the person who spotted the leopard before it spotted you. Food storage was almost non-existent, so eat when you can was a core philosophy. This meant feasts when the hunt was successful and miserable foraging when it wasn't. There was no long-term security, just a constant cycle of finding, consuming, and searching again. Adaptability was the real secret. Weather changed, rivers dried up, herds moved on, and suddenly your perfect camp became a death trap. In the prehistoric world, stubbornness was a shortcut to extinction, while flexibility, even if it meant abandoning your favorite sitting rock, kept you alive. Even leisure had a survival angle. Storytelling around the fire wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to pass on crucial knowledge. A tale about a great warrior who ignored warning signs and wandered into a swamp wasn't just drama. It was a reminder to stay out of swamps unless you enjoyed leeches and quicksand. These fireside stories became the first textbooks, the earliest history lessons, and the original self-help guides. They carried warnings, jokes, and lessons from one generation to the next. In short, survival wasn't an event. It was the culture, the economy, the religion, and the daily routine all rolled into one. Every action you took fed into the single goal of staying alive another day. And while prehistoric humans didn't know it at the time, their relentless grind through danger, hunger, and hardship was the reason we are here sitting comfortably watching a story about them. And with that, the prehistoric story closes, giving way to another tale of survival and transformation. this time not on the plains or in the forests of early humanity, but in the crowded streets and political turmoil of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Constantinople, where a girl named Theodora would rise from poverty and scandal to wear the imperial purple of Byzantium. Her life, like those of her prehistoric ancestors, was defined by danger, adaptation, and the constant struggle not just to survive, but to rule. Theodora's life began not in marble corridors or gilded palaces, but in the noisy, chaotic underbelly of Constantinople, the Hippodrome district. Around the year 500, the city was already one of the largest in the known world. Its harbour crammed with ships from across the Mediterranean, its streets filled with merchants, beggars, monks, and aristocrats. It was a place of contradictions, immense wealth, alongside crushing poverty, piety, alongside vice spectacle, alongside suffering. Into this world, Theodora was born the daughter of a bear trainer, employed by the Greens, one of the two great chariot racing factions of the Byzantine Empire. Her father's work was perilous. The Greens, like their rivals, the Blues, staged elaborate entertainments in the Hippodrome, including races, games, and shows with exotic animals. Bears were part of that spectacle, and handling them was as dangerous as it sounds. One mistake, one misstep, and the animal could maul its keeper in front of thousands. That danger became Theodora's inheritance. When her father died suddenly, her family's fragile livelihood collapsed. Her mother remarried, but the new stepfather lacked influence or wealth. Theodora, her sisters, and her mother faced the unforgiving realities of lower-class life in Constantinople. The Hippodrome was more than an arena. It was the heartbeat of Byzantine society, where tens of thousands gathered to cheer, jeer, and riot. The Greens and the Blues were not merely sports teams. They were political factions, social networks, and power brokers. Their rivalries could shake the stability of the city itself. Growing up in their shadow gave Theodora an early education in politics. Loyalty mattered, but so did the ability to read a crowd and survive shifting allegiances. She saw firsthand how factional support could elevate or destroy a career, how violence could erupt over a single race, and how rulers themselves trembled when the factions united in anger. For Theodora, survival in this world demanded wit as much as beauty. Poverty was not an abstract threat. It was the reality of her daily life. She would have seen beggars lining the streets, children selling scraps, widows hustling for coins. She would have smelled the sweat and dust of the stables, the mingled odours of food vendors' dung and incense wafting from nearby churches. Constantinople was a city of sensory overload, and to endure it meant learning to adapt quickly to seize opportunity when it appeared. As a girl, Theodora's path led naturally toward the theatre. In Byzantium, actresses were not celebrated artists. They were entertainers who walked a narrow line between comedy, pantomime, and courtesanship. Their performances were bawdy, scandalous, and often ridiculed by the elite. To the aristocracy, actresses were considered morally suspect, little better than prostitutes. But to the masses, they were magnetic figures commanding laughter, desire, and admiration in smoky theatres tied to the Hippodrome. By her early teens, Theodora had joined this world. On stage, she performed skits filled with innuendo and slapstick pantomimes where gesture meant more than words. In a culture that adored spectacle, she learned to hold an audience with nothing more than her presence, her timing, and her sharp tongue. Every night was a lesson in performance, in reading a crowd's mood, in wielding charm as both shield and weapon. To the noble classes, she was scandalous. To those in the stands, she was unforgettable. Her beauty drew attention, but it was her wit that set her apart. Theodora could tease, flatter, or humiliate with equal skill. Her words carried the edge of someone who had no illusions about life's cruelty. Patrons sought her out, some for her looks, others for her company. With them she learned that information was as valuable as coin. In whispered conversations, lubricated by wine and dim light, powerful men let slip gossip, alliances, and secrets. Theodora listened. She remembered. She learned. But the theatre was no safe harbour. Rivalries between performers were fierce, audiences were fickle, and reputations could collapse in a single night. Worse, to be an actress in Byzantium was to live always one step from disgrace. The line between entertainer and courtesan was thin, and for Theodora, like many of her peers, survival sometimes meant crossing it. Critics would later use this part of her life to brand her as immoral, unworthy of the throne she would one day occupy. But for Theodora, those years were an apprenticeship. She was studying not just performance but power, how it was displayed, how it was manipulated, how it might be seized. Her rise from these smoky theatres to the imperial palace was not straight or easy. It was a path littered with scandal, exile, and reinvention. Yet from the very beginning, Theodora displayed the qualities that would one day make her empress: resilience, intelligence, charisma, and the ability to turn hardship into opportunity. She was not raised to expect privilege. She was raised to fight for survival. And that paradoxically made her better prepared for power than many born into it. By her late teens, however, the precarious life of an actress began to collapse. She left Constantinople under circumstances clouded in rumor and scandal. Chroniclers claimed she became the mistress of a Byzantine official posted to North Africa only to be abandoned there. Alone, far from home, she was forced to rely on her wits to survive. Most women in her position would have been broken. Theodora adapted. She wandered through the eastern Mediterranean, passing through Alexandria, where she encountered Christian ascetics who impressed upon her a new sense of purpose, or perhaps gave her the excuse to reinvent herself. Whether this was true conversion or shrewd performance is impossible to say, but when she re-emerged in the historical record, she had transformed. Gone was the flamboyant actress clad in silks and scandal. In her place stood a woman dressed modestly, projecting piety, compassion, and intelligence. She cultivated a reputation for helping the poor, especially women trapped in lives like the one she had once endured. She reshaped her identity with the same precision she once used on stage. Only now her audience was not drunken theatre-goers, but bishops, officials, and merchants. By the time she returned to Constantinople, she was no longer simply surviving. She was preparing. Every gesture, every alliance, every carefully chosen word was positioning her for something greater. And it was then in this sharpened state of purpose that she met the man whose ambitions would match her own and change the course of history. The stage had given Theodora her skills. Exile had given her resilience. And both would serve her as she stepped into the most pivotal chapter of her life, meeting the man who would make her empress. When she returned to Constantinople, she was no longer the scandalous actress of her youth. She was a woman remade, modest in dress, sharp in mind and unwavering in ambition. In this transformed state, she caught the eye of a man whose own destiny was rising just as quickly. Justinian, nephew and heir of Emperor Justin I. The circumstances of their first meeting are lost to time, though later chroniclers painted it with equal parts awe and suspicion. What is certain is that Justinian was already one of the empire's most powerful figures, a man of relentless focus, gifted in law and administration, and possessed of an almost frightening drive to leave his mark on history. He surrounded himself with capable people, but few could match the intelligence and charisma of Theodora. To him, she was more than beautiful. She was captivating. She could converse on theology, politics, and philosophy with a sharpness rare among courtiers. And perhaps most importantly, she understood power, how to see it, how to use it, and how to survive it. For Theodora, Justinian was more than a lover. He was her opportunity. In him, she saw a man who could grant her access to the heart of Byzantine power, a stage grander than any theatre. Their relationship deepened quickly, but it faced a seemingly insurmountable barrier. Byzantine law forbade men of Justinian's rank from marrying actresses or women of tainted background. For the aristocracy, Theodora was unacceptable, too low-born, too scandalous, too dangerous. But Justinian was not a man to bend before tradition. He persuaded his uncle to change the law itself, an extraordinary move that shocked Constantinople's elite. In a single stroke of legislation, he cleared the path to make Theodora his wife. Their marriage around the year 525 scandalized the nobility. To them, it was an outrage. To Theodora, it was destiny fulfilled. She had crossed the gulf from the dusty, dangerous hippodrome to the glittering throne room of the imperial palace. 2 years later, history accelerated. In 527, Emperor Justin I, aging and infirm, formally crowned Justinian as co-emperor. Months later, the old emperor died, leaving Justinian as sole ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. Beside him, Theodora was elevated to the title of Augusta, the highest honor for an empress. And from the very beginning, she refused to be a ceremonial ornament. She wore imperial purple with a confidence that rivaled her husband's own. She sat beside him at ceremonies, council meetings, and public audiences. She was not behind him, she was with him. Theodora quickly became more than a partner. She became a co-sovereign in all but name. She participated in state deliberations, advised on policies, and used her influence to shape imperial decisions. Her background gave her an unusual empathy for the marginalized, and she urged Justinian to enact reforms protecting women, particularly those forced into prostitution or left vulnerable as widows. She pushed for changes to property and guardianship laws, granting women more security and legal rights than they had known before. She funded a large refuge in Constantinople, the House of Repentance, where women escaping exploitation could find food, shelter, and training. For her, these laws were not abstractions, they were personal. But Theodora's rise did not go unchallenged. Many senators sneered at her lowly origins. Some whispered that she was manipulative, vindictive, even dangerous. Procopius, the court historian, would later unleash his infamous secret history portraying her as cruel and calculating. Whether these stories were fact or slander, they reveal the depth of unease she inspired among the ruling elite. An empress was supposed to smile, bow, and fade into the background. Theodora did none of these. She also understood the theater of power. Her public appearances were carefully staged, her robes dazzling with jewels and purple silk, her presence radiating authority. She turned processions through Constantinople into demonstrations of majesty. Every bow of a courtier, every cheer from the crowd, reinforced the message that Theodora was not merely Justinian's consort, she was his equal. And soon that equality would be tested in fire. In the 5th of January 32, Constantinople erupted in one of the bloodiest riots in its history, the Nika Revolt. What began as a dispute between the Greens and Blues in the Hippodrome spiraled into a city-wide rebellion. Tens of thousands shouted Nika victory as they burned districts, looted homes, and even torched the great church of Hagia Sophia. The mob turned its fury against Justinian himself, and the palace trembled under the threat of overthrow. Inside, panic reigned. Advisors begged Justinian to flee by sea to save his life and abandon the capital. Even the emperor wavered, recognizing that staying could mean death. But Theodora did not waver. She rose and delivered words that echoed through history. If flight were the only means of safety, still I would not flee. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. For me, the royal purple is the noblest shroud. Her message was unmistakable. She would rather die as empress than live in disgrace. Her courage shamed the fearful and steadied Justinian himself. With her resolve, he chose to fight. Generals Belisarius and Mundus were summoned. A plan was made. The rebels were lured back into the Hippodrome, its gates sealed, and then imperial troops slaughtered them in the tens of thousands. The rebellion ended in blood, but the throne was saved. Theodora had passed her trial by fire. She was no longer simply an empress. She was the protector of the empire. And for the rest of her life, none would doubt that when Byzantium trembled, it was Theodora who had given it steel. With the Nika revolt crushed and the city once again in imperial hands, Theodora's role as co-ruler was undeniable. She had not merely stood beside Justinian, she had steadied him when even his most trusted advisors faltered. From that moment onward, her presence in governance was not symbolic, it was essential. She turned her attention toward reforms and protections that reflected her own hard upbringing. The laws of Byzantium had long favored men and women who found themselves abandoned, widowed, or indebted, often had no recourse but exploitation. Theodora moved to change that. Together with Justinian, she championed new legislation that struck at the roots of systemic vulnerability. It became illegal to force women into prostitution, a practice that had condemned countless girls to lives of misery. She founded and funded the House of Repentance, a massive refuge in Constantinople, where women could escape exploitation, receive food and shelter, and be trained in useful trades. For Theodora, these were not abstract measures. They were born of her own memories, the smoky theatres, the desperation of poverty, the knowledge of how thin the line between survival and ruin truly was. Her reforms went further. She reshaped inheritance laws so that daughters could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. Widows were granted rights to retain their dowries and secure their households against predatory relatives. Divorce laws, long stacked in favor of men, were modified to give women more agency in cases of abuse or neglect. Guardianship rules were tightened to protect orphans from greedy uncles or cousins who sought to control their estates. Each of these changes, while limited by modern standards, marked a revolutionary shift in Byzantine law. For many women, it meant the difference between destitution and dignity. Her concern for the vulnerable extended beyond gender. She moved against corrupt provincial governors who frequently exploited their subjects with excessive taxes or abuses of power. Theodora insisted on accountability, dispatching inspectors to investigate complaints and demanding that officials answer for their conduct. In doing so, she earned the admiration of the lower classes and the resentment of the aristocracy, who saw her interference as an affront to their authority. Religion, too, became a stage where she exerted influence. Justinian sought to unify the empire under Orthodox Christianity, but Theodora sympathized with the Monophysites, a Christian sect often persecuted within the empire. She provided refuge for their clergy and used her voice to temper imperial policies against them. Some saw this as a dangerous wedge between husband and wife. Others recognized it as a calculated balance. The throne could not afford to alienate all factions, and by supporting the marginalized sect, Theodora ensured their loyalty to her personally. Foreign policy was another arena where her subtle hand appeared. She corresponded with foreign queens and empresses, understanding the unique burdens of female rule in male-dominated courts. These exchanges created channels of diplomacy that softened hostilities and forged alliances in ways that armies could not. She recognized that power did not always flow from swords and treaties, but sometimes from letters written in careful, persuasive words. Her influence was not without enemies. Many senators still sneered at her origins, whispering behind her back that she was manipulative and cruel. Procopius, in his secret history, would later write venomous accounts of her supposed vindictiveness, depicting her as scheming and merciless. Whether these accusations reflected truth or political slander is unclear. What is clear is that she inspired fear, and in the Byzantine court, fear was often the clearest measure of power. Despite criticism, she wielded her influence with confidence. She cultivated an image of regal dignity, adorned in jewels and silks, her presence at ceremonies commanding awe. Public appearances were deliberate processions through Constantinople, where the crowd could see her not as the daughter of a bear trainer or a discarded actress, but as Augusta equal in majesty to the emperor himself. Her sharp wit became legendary. Courtiers feared crossing her, knowing she could cut them down with a single remark as easily as Justinian could with a law. Theodora had become indispensable. She was a voice for the voiceless, a shield for the vulnerable, and a shrewd strategist in the palace's endless web of intrigue. Yet she was also ruthless when needed. She could remove rivals from power without hesitation, manipulate alliances to her advantage, and enforce her will with the same authority as Justinian. In an age when women were expected to rule quietly, if at all, she ruled openly. And she did it with unmistakable purpose. By the mid-542, however, her formidable presence began to wane, not from scandal nor political defeat, but from illness. Sources differ. Some suggest cancer, others a lingering infection. Whatever the cause, it weakened her steadily. Yet even as her body failed, her mind and will remained unbroken. She continued to advise Justinian, met with envoys, and pressed for the completion of her charitable projects. She refused to withdraw, She had lived her life in struggle, and she would not yield now. For Justinian, her decline was devastating. Their marriage had been more than companionship. It had been a partnership of rule forged in crises and triumphs. He ensured she had the best physicians, the closest attendants, the finest care. But nothing could stop the course of her illness. In 548, Theodora died at the age of 48. Her passing shook Constantinople. Even her enemies who had whispered against her in life could not deny that she had left an indelible mark on the empire. Justinian buried her in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the resting place of emperors, granting her the honor of a ruler in her own right. Her influence did not die with her. The reforms she championed endured for centuries, shaping Byzantine society long after her voice was silenced. Her image was immortalized in art and architecture, most famously in the mosaics of San Vitale in Ravenna, where she stands beside Justinian, haloed and crowned not behind him, but beside him. A fitting image for a woman who refused to fade into the background. Theodora's life was one of contradictions. From the dust of the hippodrome to the marble halls of the palace, from the scandal of the stage to the sanctity of imperial purple. She was compassionate and ruthless, modest and ambitious, vulnerable and invincible. Above all, she was unforgettable, a woman who reshaped the empire's laws, its politics, and its perception of what an empress could be. In the centuries after Theodora's death, the Byzantine Empire endured, transformed and struggled, while Europe to the west moved through its own long ages of upheaval and change. By the late Middle Ages, a new world of ritual and refinement was emerging in the courts of kings, dukes and princes. Here survival no longer depended on spotting predators in the grass or rallying troops in a burning hippodrome. Instead, survival depended on reputation, etiquette, and the ability to master subtle displays of power. Among these displays, none carried more significance than the art of dance. Noble gatherings of the early medieval centuries had been boisterous, often resembling little more than feasts turned to chaos. Long wooden trestle tables groaned under roasted meats and pitchers of spiced wine. Minstrels played bawdy tunes while guests leapt to their feet in spontaneous, unrefined movements. It was an atmosphere of noise and vitality, more a celebration of energy than elegance. Dancing was free, unmeasured, and fueled by drink. It belonged to the moment with little thought for grace or order. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, the atmosphere of Europe's courts was changing. Chivalry, that curious blend of martial discipline and poetic ideal, reshaped the expectations of noble conduct. No longer was it enough to show wealth through feasting or prowess through jousting. One also needed to display refinement, poise restraint, and cultured manners. The court became a theatre in which every gesture and movement signaled breeding dignity and power. Dancing, once rustic diversion, became central to this silent performance. At the heart of this transformation were the great courts themselves. Burgundy, Milan, Paris, and later the courts of England and Spain all cultivated an atmosphere of ritual where noble life was lived under constant observation. To walk, to speak, to bow incorrectly was to risk humiliation. To dance well was to display mastery of the body as well as the mind. A stumble was not simply clumsiness. It could be interpreted as a lack of control of discipline, even of moral worth. Every turn on the dance floor became a mirror of one's place in society. The bass dance, literally the low dance, emerged first as the model of this new elegance. Originating in Burgundy, it was slow, deliberate, and gliding a stark contrast to the stomping and leaping of earlier celebrations. Partners advanced and retreated in smooth, measured steps, feet never rising far from the ground. The upper body remained still dignified as though the dancer were floating. To execute it well required balance, patience, and the ability to move in perfect time with the music. It was less a dance than a ritual of grace. The music itself reinforced this atmosphere. Ensembles of shawms, sackbuts, viols, and harps wove melodies above a steady tenor line, a rhythm so measured it seemed inevitable, like the turning of a wheel. Dancers matched each phrase with precise sequences, 4 steps forward, 4 steps back, a bow, a turn, a glide. Nothing was left to improvisation. Everything was rehearsed, polished, and codified. The effect was mesmerizing. In a candlelit hall with gowns sweeping the polished floor and jewels catching the firelight, the bass dance turned the nobility into a living tapestry of color and movement. From Burgundy, this style spread across Europe. In France, it became the standard of refinement, the opening dance of great occasions. In Italy, it was elaborated upon by masters who delighted in complex figures and faster tempos. In England, it mingled with rustic traditions so that a court event might begin with a pavan or bass dance, but end with lively country steps that allowed a lighter mood. In Spain, Moorish influence brought in rhythmic footwork and hand movements, adding a distinctive Iberian flavor to the otherwise uniform language of noble dance. By the end of the 15th century, a new form arose, the pavan. Slower still, grander still, it turned the dance floor into a processional stage. Couples moved in stately lines every step, an opportunity to display the fall of a brocaded sleeve, the glitter of a jeweled chain, the gleam of gold embroidery. If the bass dance was about elegance, the pavan was about majesty. To watch it was to watch power itself moving in silk slippers. In these courtly dances, politics and romance intertwined. To invite a partner to dance was no casual gesture. It was a declaration, sometimes of affection, sometimes of alliance, sometimes of ambition. To accept or refuse carried implications that could ripple through the court for weeks. Who led the opening dance? Who stood in the front ranks? Who found themselves waiting at the edges? All of it spoke volumes about hierarchy. To dance well was to command attention. To falter was to risk disgrace. Behind the scenes stood the dance masters, professionals, who codified the steps, drilled young nobles, and ensured no one embarrassed themselves before royalty. They were more than teachers. They were stage managers of courtly politics, quietly pairing certain figures together, keeping others apart, and curating the spectacle so that it reinforced the authority of the host. They traveled from court to court, spreading fashions, writing manuals, and collaborating with musicians to craft performances that dazzled guests and dignitaries alike. Costume and music completed the illusion. Women's gowns, heavy with silk and velvet, were designed to trail and sweep with every measured step. Men's doublets and hose, stiff with embroidery, turned bows and turns into displays of color and light. Musicians tuned their instruments not only to fill vast halls, but to echo the very rhythm of dignity itself. Every element was coordinated, every movement symbolic, and beneath it all the game of romance played on. Courtly love, with its rituals of admiration and longing, found a perfect stage in the controlled intimacy of dance. A glance, a prolonged touch of the hand, a deeper bow than necessary, all could be interpreted as signals of desire veiled beneath etiquette. For many young nobles, their first experiences of attraction, courtship, even marriage alliances, began not with words, but with steps taken to the slow rhythm of a pavan. Thus, by the close of the Middle Ages, dance had evolved from spontaneous celebration into one of the most refined expressions of noble identity. It was theatre, diplomacy, and romance all at once. It showed who belonged and who did not, who rose and who fell, who ruled and who obeyed. In the silent language of gliding steps and lowered gazes, the medieval elite rehearsed the very order of their world. The pace of the pavan was so deliberate that every step became an event. Each glide forward was a chance to display the fall of a gown's heavy silk, each turn a showcase for the jeweled chains that glittered under candlelight. In this dance movement was not about covering distance, but about demonstrating control. The body was a vessel for wealth, dignity, and restraint, and the slow tempo gave the audience time to absorb every detail. Unlike the frantic stomping of rustic dances, the pavan proclaimed calm authority. It was a declaration that those who danced it did not need to hurry for anything in life. The music matched the movement, stately, rich and layered. Lutes and viols blended with shawms and early keyboard instruments like virginals or harpsichords, producing a tapestry of sound that seemed to envelop the hall. The rhythm was steady, usually in duple time, grouping steps into sets of 4 or 8, so that dancers could anticipate each phrase with precision. This made the choreography feel inevitable, like the march of seasons or the turning of celestial spheres. Every note reinforced hierarchy, and every bow was a mirror of order. Socially, the pavane was a map of rank. The highest nobles led the procession with kings and queens at the very front, followed by dukes, counts, and courtiers in descending order of status. Placement in line mattered, as did the choice of partner. To dance at the front of the hall was to display one's preeminence. To be relegated to the rear was a quiet humiliation. Even the cut of a robe, the brightness of a jewel, or the richness of embroidery spoke silently of favor alliances and political weight. The pavane was as much a performance of social standing as it was a dance, yet beneath its formality, the pavane carried a thread of romance. The controlled movements, the measured hand clasps, the prolonged eye contact permitted within its stately rhythm, all created opportunities for subtle gestures of intimacy. A glance held a fraction longer than necessary, the brush of a sleeve, a bow, executed with deeper flourish, each could send messages understood only by the two participants. In a court where overt declarations of love could cause scandal or political danger, the dance floor offered a rare space for coded expression. Courtly dance was always layered with such meanings. To invite someone to dance was never casual. It was an overture, sometimes romantic, sometimes political. Accepting or refusing carried equal weight. A refusal could signify disapproval or create a rift. Acceptance could signal alliance or a willingness to entertain affection. For this reason, invitations were carefully considered. A noble who wished to rise in favor might ask the hand of a partner with powerful family ties. A young courtier hoping to spark romance might dare to request a dance from someone just beyond their social reach. The decision of the lady to accept or decline was equally strategic, for her gesture would be scrutinized not only by her suitor but by every watching eye. The arrangement of dances was also meticulously observed. Leading the first set of dances was a privilege reserved for the most honored guests or the most powerful nobles. To be excluded was a social wound, sometimes worse than open insult. Dance masters, the unseen arbiters of the floor, orchestrated these details, carefully acting as silent facilitators of politics. By choosing who danced with whom, when and where, they could encourage reconciliation between rivals, allow discreet encounters between hopeful suitors or separate figures whose interactions might scandalize the court. The dance master was more than an instructor. He was a choreographer of spectacle, a guardian of etiquette, and sometimes a broker of alliances. His lessons extended far beyond steps. Pupils learned how to bow with just the right degree of respect, how to keep the body poised during turns, how to move with an air of dignity that reflected family honor. Training was rigorous. Hours of repetition drilled into students the timing of each movement, the control of posture, and the delicate balance between restraint and flourish. For young nobles, success on the floor was success in life. A stumble could echo for years as a stain on memory. Costume amplified the dance. Women's gowns were designed with movement in mind, heavy skirts that trailed like waves across polished floors, sleeves so long they brushed the ground fabrics of velvet and silk that caught the flicker of candlelight. Men's attire with doublets stiffened by embroidery and cloaks that flared with each turn transformed even simple steps into displays of grandeur. Color itself was symbolic. Deep crimson, royal blue and gold embroidery proclaimed wealth, while heraldic patterns announced lineage and alliances. Clothing was not merely decorative, it was a language woven into every step. Music filled the halls with its own grandeur. Ensembles adapted to the mood of the evening, slow, solemn harmonies for the pavane, lighter, more spirited melodies for faster dances later in the night. Shawms and sackbuts provided weight and depth. Lutes, harps, and recorders wove ornament above them. The coordination of music and choreography was seamless, every phrase matched to a bow or a turn, so that dancers moved as if they were extensions of the melody itself. The halls themselves became theaters of light and sound. Candle flames reflected on polished stone floors and gilded ceilings. Tapestries hung from the walls depicting myths of love and valor, reinforcing the ideals enacted on the floor below. In such settings, Dance was never just recreation. It was a carefully staged performance where power was seen, hierarchy was reaffirmed, and romance was acted out under watchful eyes. And always behind the elegance the game of attraction played on. Courtly love, with its rituals of longing and restraint, found perfect expression in these dances. Partners approached, retreated, circled each other, mimicking the pursuit of romance. A bow could express admiration, a turn could suggest hesitation, a prolonged touch might hint at promise. For many young nobles, a dance was their first true experience of intimacy, carefully hidden within layers of etiquette. The floor became both a playground and a battlefield of the heart. Regional variations gave this world richness. In Italy, dance was quicker, more theatrical, filled with intricate floor patterns and alternating tempos. Manuals began to be written by Italian masters, turning dance into a discipline with its own literature. In France, the Burgundian style emphasized stately grace, spreading across Europe as the model of refinement. England absorbed influences from both, mixing formal court dances with livelier folk traditions in informal settings. In Spain, centuries of cultural exchange infused dances with Moorish rhythms and gestures, adding a flavor unlike anywhere else in Europe. Marriages, diplomatic visits, and tournaments carried these styles across borders, creating a shared language of movement that was both international and distinctly regional. By the dawn of the Renaissance, courtly dance was no longer just a pastime. It was an institution, a formalized art that blended etiquette, politics, and romance into one glittering display. The base dance and pavane laid the foundation, while new dances like the galliard with its leaps and spins would soon add vigor to the repertoire. But the ideals remained constant: discipline, harmony, elegance, and order. To move gracefully was to live nobly. To falter was to fail. Even today, when we imagine the courts of medieval Europe, it is these images that come to mind. Candlelit halls, richly dressed nobles, gliding to slow music, each step a word in the unspoken language of power and love. For the men and women who lived it, the dance was more than entertainment. It was their world in motion. The late medieval courts, with their candlelit dances and silent politics of gesture, represented one form of power, the power of refinement, spectacle, and ritual. But elsewhere in Europe, another kind of power was rising from the sea, not gliding across polished floors, but cutting through mist and river water in long, narrow ships carved with dragons and painted shields. If the pavane was power displayed with silk sleeves, the Viking longship was power displayed with iron and fire, and among those who commanded it, few names carried more terror into the hearts of medieval Europeans than Ragnar Lodbrok. It began with a sound, a rhythmic thump, steady, relentless, like the heartbeat of some enormous beast. The thump of oars striking water in unison, dozens upon dozens of them echoing across the grey morning mist. At first faint, then unmistakable, the sound announced that something vast was moving up the River Seine. Out of the fog appeared the shapes, long narrow silhouettes, slicing effortlessly against the current. Each prow was carved into monstrous figures, dragons with snarling jaws, serpents with glaring eyes. Shields of gold, red and black, lined their sides, catching what light the sun could pierce through the haze. These were not merchant ships, they were warships. At their head towered a flagship larger and more ornate than the rest. Upon its deck stood Ragnar himself, wrapped in furs, mail gleaming at his shoulders, his face marked by wind, storm, and battle. To the villagers who watched from the riverbanks, he was less a man than a legend made flesh, the raider whose name had travelled further than the reach of his sails. Behind him, a fleet chroniclers, later numbered at 120 ships, surged forward carrying perhaps 5,000 warriors. Axes, spears, and swords flashed in the morning light, and the shields of Denmark and Norway gleamed like rows of teeth. Villages along the Seine had heard the rumours. They knew the stories whispered from coast to coast of raids, where towns were burned, churches stripped of their relics, and survivors carried away in chains. As the fleet passed, many dropped to their knees, muttering desperate prayers. Some fled inland, clutching their children. Others stood frozen, knowing that there was nowhere far enough to hide. Ragnar's eyes never left the water ahead. His target was not another nameless hamlet. It was Paris Jewel of the Frankish kingdom, a city of stone walls, fortified bridges, and towering churches heavy with gold. The Seine, winding deep into Frankish lands, was an invitation too tempting to resist. Ragnar was no mere raider looking for plunder. He was a commander intent on proving that even the heart of Europe could tremble before the Northmen. King Charles the Bald, ruling the western Frankish kingdom, had received warning of the threat. Scouts and terrified refugees carried word of the fleet upriver. At first, some thought it was another raid of a few ships, but when the drums and oars of Ragnar's fleet reached the outskirts of Paris in the spring of 845, the truth was undeniable. This was not a raid, it was an invasion. Charles scrambled to gather his forces. His armies were scattered across the kingdom, and only a modest contingent could be raised quickly. Yet the king knew he could not allow the Vikings to march unopposed. He ordered his men to take position along a narrow stretch of the river bank where the Seine curved and the longships would be forced to slow. Ragnar, however, expected resistance. He ran several of his ships ashore, letting warriors pour onto the banks. They formed shield walls, planks of wood and iron interlocked their formation, bristling with spears. Behind that line, axemen waited for the order to charge. The Franks advanced with their long spears and armoured cavalry banners snapping in the wind. The first clash was ferocious. Spears met shields, axes cut into wood and flesh, and the roar of Viking war cries filled the air. The Franks fought with discipline, their ranks pushing forward in unison, but the ferocity of Ragnar's men was unlike anything they had faced. The air rang with guttural shouts meant to terrify as much as to kill. Chroniclers claimed Ragnar himself fought at the centre, his sword cutting a path wherever he turned. The Frankish cavalry charged, scattering part of the Viking line, but from the tree line, Ragnar's hidden reserves surged out, striking the flank with sudden force. The Frankish formation wavered. Panic spread, and men began to flee. Some tried to fight their way back to Paris. Others cast themselves into the river in desperation. By midday, the Frankish forward guard had collapsed entirely. Ragnar had achieved his first objective. The road and river to Paris lay open. By evening, his fleet reassembled shields, now streaked with blood, but morale higher than ever. The Seine itself became a weapon in his hands. He anchored his ships in both channels around the Ile de la Cité, their prows facing upstream, blocking supplies and trade. Paris, which had relied on the river for its lifeblood, now found it turned against them. Ragnar ordered raiding parties into the suburbs, burning farms, granaries and warehouses left unprotected. Smoke rose above the city's skyline, black columns that carried a clear message: Paris was under Viking control. Inside the city walls, tension boiled. Priests led processions along the ramparts, begging for divine intervention. Merchants worried their goods would rot. Families crowded into monasteries, whispering fears that hunger and disease would strike before swords did. Paris, for all its walls and bridges, was a city under siege, and its people knew it. Ragnar's blockade was tightening with each passing day. Every night the Vikings reminded them of their presence. Torchlit parades along the riverbank's shield, banging shouted taunts in Old Norse, all carried across the water, denying the city even the solace of sleep. Arrows tipped with fire sometimes sailed into outer districts, setting small blazes and fueling terror. For the Franks, it was a nightmare. To attempt another battle risked annihilation. To sit behind the walls meant starvation. And all the while Ragnar Lodbrok watched from his flagship Patient, confident, certain that Paris would break, not by force of arms, but by force of fear. By the second week of the Viking presence, Paris had become a city suffocating under the weight of fear. Ragnar Lodbrok had not stormed the gates, nor thrown his men recklessly against the walls. Instead, he let hunger and terror gnaw at the defenders as surely as any axe. His ships anchored in a crescent along the Seine controlled every crossing. His men raided the outlying farms, carrying off livestock and grain, burning what they could not take. Each day the smoke rose higher, a black wreath circling the capital of the Franks. The blockade was complete. No cart could leave, no merchant barge could slip through. The Seine, once the artery of Paris, was now its chokehold. Inside the walls, supplies dwindled quickly. The wealthy hoarded what they could, while the poor lined up at monasteries begging for bread. Rumors spread of families boiling leather scraps into broth of pigeons and dogs disappearing from the streets of meals, reduced to a crust shared among 5 mouths. The defenders' morale crumbled as their stomachs emptied. King Charles the Bald's garrison stationed along the bridges, and towers began to falter. Some men deserted their posts to look for food. Others fell sick from tainted water. And sickness, silent, merciless, soon became Ragnar's most effective ally. At first it was whispers. A soldier struck with fever, a merchant collapsing at his stall. Then came swelling, coughing, and blotches on the skin. Whatever the disease, perhaps dysentery from fouled water, perhaps plague carried by vermin, it spread like fire through the crowded homes of the besieged. Monasteries overflowed with the dying. Priests whispered last rites until their voices cracked. Bells tolled so often they seemed never to stop. Fear thickened the air. Some claimed God was punishing the Franks for their sins. Others muttered of traitors poisoning wells. Still others believed the very presence of the pagan Norse outside the walls had cursed the city. From his flagship, Ragnar saw the change. The torches on the walls burned dimmer at night. Patrols thinned. The chants of priests grew hoarse, replaced by the coughing chorus of the sick. The city was still standing, but it was hollowing from within. Ragnar had patience. He knew that a starving, diseased city could not endure. Yet the Franks could not simply sit idle. One grey morning, Paris attempted a desperate breakout. From the right bank the gates creaked open, and a column of soldiers marched forth. Spearmen in tight formation, banners snapping in the drizzle, cavalry at their head. Their goal was simple: strike the Viking camps along the river, seize food, and return before Ragnar could rally his forces. But Ragnar's scouts had seen them coming. The moment the Franks reached the muddy fields by the Seine, Viking horns sounded. Shield walls slammed into place, lines of warriors interlocking like a living fortress. Behind them, axemen and archers waited. The Franks advanced bravely, their cavalry charging into the Viking front. For a moment it seemed they might break through, but then Ragnar unleashed his hidden reserves from the tree line. They crashed into the Frankish flank with savage force. Horses panicked, infantry faltered, and the retreat turned into a rout. The survivors fled back toward Paris. But the narrow causeway to the gates clogged with terrified men. Many were cut down before the portcullis fell shut behind them. When the dust settled, Paris had fewer defenders than before, and Ragnar's men stood laughing amid the corpses. The sortie had failed. Inside Paris, despair deepened. The failed breakout meant no relief would come from within, and King Charles the Bald, far from the city, knew that his throne itself was at risk. If Paris fell, the jewel of his kingdom would be gone, and with it the confidence of his subjects. Rebellion, fragmentation, and disaster would follow. He could not let Paris be sacked, yet he had no army strong enough to break Ragnar's grip, so Charles turned to humiliation. He opened negotiations. Envoys were sent downriver under a flag of truce, their boat drifting past lines of longships whose painted prows glared at them like living beasts. Brought aboard Ragnar's flagship, they faced the man who had brought their kingdom to its knees without breaching a single wall. Ragnar, they reported, was calm, confident, even mocking. His demand was clear: 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. It was an impossible sum, more than most kingdoms could muster in years. The envoys protested. Ragnar replied with a chilling alternative: refuse, and Paris would burn its defenders, slaughtered its people, chained and sold across the north. He reminded them of the villages still smouldering upriver, visible proof of what awaited the city. The envoys returned with the ultimatum. In the halls of Charles's court, nobles argued furiously. To pay was to admit weakness, to enrich the pagans, to bleed the treasury dry. But to refuse was to gamble the survival of Paris itself. At last Charles chose shame over ruin. He ordered the ransom raised. Chalices from monasteries were melted down. ornaments from churches stripped of their gold coins, gathered from royal coffers and noble estates alike. Slowly, painfully, the mountain of treasure grew. When at last it was delivered, cart after cart rolled down to the river under heavy guard. Priests muttered prayers over the silver, as though it might absolve the humiliation. Ragnar's men weighed it, counted it, divided it. Every warrior received his share, from the lowest oarsman to the chieftains at Ragnar's side. The treasure gleamed in the mist, brighter to the Vikings than any cathedral spire. Ragnar had achieved the impossible. Without storming a gate, without sacrificing his army in bloody assault, he had bent one of Europe's mightiest kingdoms. Paris had paid for its life. When the longships finally prepared to depart, the Franks held their breath, fearing treachery. But Ragnar was true to his bargain. He ordered the fleet to pull away sails, rising shields, gleaming horns, blaring not as a threat but as a reminder. Chroniclers later claimed that Frankish captives were forced to shout warnings from the decks, promising that if Charles or his heirs forgot this lesson, the Northmen would return. As the fleet drifted downstream, the bells of Paris rang in relief. Priests led thanksgiving processions, but the joy was muted. The coffers of the kingdom were emptied, the pride of the Franks humbled. Paris still stood, but it stood under the shadow of Ragnar Lodbrok's triumph. For Ragnar himself, the victory was more than wealth. It was legend. He had proven that even the richest city of the Franks could be forced to its knees by the will of the Northmen. Across Europe, his name spread further than his sails had ever reached. And in the sagas told by the firesides of Scandinavia, the story of the day Paris ransomed its life would be repeated for generations. When the dragon-prowed ships disappeared into the river, mists of the Seine Paris exhaled. Its walls still stood, its churches had not burned, its people were not carried away in chains. But the price of survival was humiliation. 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, an immense ransom that drained the Frankish treasury, had purchased peace. King Charles the Bald could claim his capital had endured, but the truth was whispered everywhere. Paris had been spared not by swords, but by coin. For Ragnar Lodbrok, the voyage home sealed his legend. In the sagas of Scandinavia, his name was etched as the man who humbled kings, who forced an empire to its knees with nothing more than ships, patience, and fire. Whether every detail was true or embroidered with the colours of myth mattered little. What endured was the image Ragnar standing at the prow of his flagship furs, whipping in the wind, his laughter carrying across the water as Paris bought its life. The sagas would tell of him for centuries. Some say he wore a cloak of strange hairy skins and carried himself with the wildness of a wolf. Others say he met his end not in triumph, but in tragedy, cast into a pit of serpents by a rival king. Yet the line between history and legend blurred with every retelling. Was Ragnar one man or a memory stitched together from the deeds of many Viking chieftains? Historians debate still. But for the people of the 9th century, the question mattered little. To them, Ragnar was as real as the smoke rising from their villages, as real as the gold carried north. His story was not merely of conquest. It was a tale of how power could be exercised in silence as much as in noise. He showed that a city could be broken, not by battering rams, but by starvation, fear, and the steady patience of warriors who knew time was on their side. His strategy at Paris was not reckless plunder. It was measured, deliberate, almost theatrical, and like the stately pavanays of the courts far to the south, it was a performance only here. The steps were battles, the music was the thump of oars, and the audience was an entire kingdom forced to watch. In the centuries that followed, Paris would rise again. It would endure more Viking sieges, it would harden its defences, and eventually it would become the heart of a kingdom powerful enough to resist. But the memory of 845 lingered like an old scar. It was a reminder that even the strongest walls could not save a city when the river itself belonged to its enemies. As for Ragnar, his legacy lived in story and song, and in the nightmares of kings who knew the Northmen were not finished. From the shores of England to the valleys of Ireland, from the rivers of Francia to the coasts of Spain, the dragon ships would come again. Some carried his sons who carved their own bloody paths into history, and each time the longships appeared, people remembered Paris and whispered his name. Even now, more than 1,000 years later, the tale of Ragnar's siege still captures us. It reminds us that history is not only dates and treaties, but lived fear, smoke on the horizon, and choices made in desperation. It reminds us of the thin line between myth and fact, how a man of flesh and blood can become larger than life, and how the echoes of his oars can still be heard if we listen closely to the rivers of Europe. And so our journey tonight comes to its close. We have walked through the fragile mornings of prehistoric humans, the dust and theatre of Theodora's Constantinople, the gliding steps of late medieval courts, and the thunder of Viking drums on the Seine. Each age so different, yet bound by the same human thread, the struggle to survive, to rise, to leave a mark that time itself cannot erase. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. I hope you found some comfort in the quiet telling of these noisy, violent centuries. If you enjoyed this journey through the forgotten paths of history, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and letting me know in the comments where in the world and at what hour you joined us tonight. It's always remarkable to see how far these stories travel across oceans and time zones, just as the longships once did. Dim the lights, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of the past fade into silence. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams carry you safely through the ages.